Mr. Sitilides, thank you very much for your time and being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. How could you characterize the situation in Turkey after the referendum?
Extremely polarized. It is about as divided a country as we've seen in modern Turkish history. And you have half the country that loves Erdogan or seemingly loves President Erdogan, and half the country that hates him. If they didn't hate him before, they hate him now for the way this election was conducted. And you saw that in the election, the referendum turnout, 51-49, but with a number of irregularities that he refuses to concede to. And my concern is, from an American standpoint, that we have a country that is politically very bitterly divided, that will not be reunited in any serious way anytime in the near future, led by somebody who seems to care very little about the wishes of 49% of his countrymen. So I think we're in for a period of extreme polarization and possibly very unstable domestic politics in Turkey for some time to come.
What do you think? How can this situation on the referendum, results of referendum, also the death penalty that Erdogan wants to restart, how can all this affect the Turkey-EU relations?
I don't know to what extent he'll actually proceed with the implementation, the enactment and the implementation of a death penalty. We know that he's been threatening it ever since the July 2016 coup. If he proceeds with it, it'll basically be the final nail in the coffin of the EU accession talks for Turkey. But I would say also to a large extent that the EU-Turkey relationship has been in a very negative direction for quite some time. Really since about the second election, the re-election of Erdogan back in 06-07. And looking back now, many people believe that Erdogan used the EU accession process, not because he was actually serious, but ever fully engaging that process, but to achieve his domestic political objectives, primarily to put the army in a place where they can no longer threaten him, which is why the coup last year was so shocking. But he actually famously said once upon a time that a democracy is like a train that you get on until you get to the destination you want, and then you get off. And we now wonder whether the referendum was the stop where he gets off and now moves in an undemocratic, illiberal fashion towards a more majoritarian or authoritarian direction for the country.
And what effect can these results of the referendum and the situation have on Turkish-US relations?
I don't know that it'll have a major impact right now. The U.S. has been much more willing to deal with what we would call the severe ups and downs in Turkish democracy since the early 1960s, when we saw a coup in that period, a coup again 10 years later, a coup again another 10 years later. So the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we had outright coups and military dictatorship. Then we had soft coups or electronic coups in 1997 and again about 10 years or so ago. But because Turkey occupies such a geostrategically important piece of real estate from a United States perspective, and the Turkish leadership has very smartly positioned itself in almost every major regional or global national security issue now, from the EU and Northern Africa all the way as far east as Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and the like. The Turks are necessarily part of a broader national security conversation, and so the U.S. has been willing to put certain issues into a secondary tier, foreign relations, including with Armenia, which we'll chat about, but also the domestic situation in Turkey for the sake of ensuring Turkish partnership and defense cooperation on a series of critical national security objectives.
I want to remind Angela Merkel's remark that maybe there is a possibility to find some other military bases in Cyprus, for example, to not to use the Incirlik in Turkey.
That's actually not a new discussion. We've been talking about this here in Washington for quite some time. So we do know, of course, that the British maintain two very effective and very highly capable sovereign bases on the southern coast of Cyprus. But Cyprus itself also has a small air base near the western city of Paphos, which can be easily upgraded and modernized to be able to handle the heaviest cargo planes and the largest fighter jets and the like for possible use in the Middle East. that would require a separate relationship, I think, between the United States and Cyprus. It couldn't be under the rubric of NATO because Turkey, as a member of NATO, would not allow NATO to enter into that agreement. But you could have bilateral agreements between the US and Cyprus, between France and Cyprus, the UK and Cyprus, although the UK has its own bases. But there are different ways of operating out of that region, including, of course, aircraft carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. But the idea of alternate air bases is not a new one. It's just welcome that Angela Merkel is very wisely looking at possible alternatives in the event that the Turkish government, for whatever reason, decides to shut down Incirlik for Western operations in the Middle East.
Do you think there's any possibility to restart the reconciliation process between Armenia and Turkey?
I do. I just don't know that it's going to happen anytime soon. I think right now Erdogan is so focused, first of all, on consolidating the gains from the referendum victory, and that's going to consume an enormous amount of his own energy and resources. But I think from a foreign policy perspective, the number one problem from a Turkish perspective is the possibility that there'll be an independent Kurdistan anytime in the next few months, next several years. And we're very interested here in Washington to see what kind of choices President Erdogan will make and the Turkish government will make going forward to cooperate with the United States in a military campaign, along with a number of Sunni countries in the Middle East, to defeat the Islamic State in Syria and in Iraq, and then to look to see how we might work with Russia to forge a new leadership in Syria beyond the Assad regime. So those are the two major U.S. goals right south of Turkey's border right now. And the issue will be how much of Erdogan's energy will the Syria war and Islamic State in Syria and Iraq and preventing Kurdistan from ever being established consume. But it doesn't mean that he can't pursue other foreign policy initiatives also. The question really is, what does Turkey want in exchange for reconciliation with Armenia, with Yerevan, and how much of that also brings the Nagorno-Karabakh situation into that mix? So it's a bit complex, but there's really no reason why it can't be pursued. The question is, when does Erdogan want to start devoting political capital and energy in that direction? And we don't see that indication today.
In Washington particularly, also in Los Angeles, in the big cities in the United States and all over the world, when Armenians commemorate the anniversaries of the Armenian genocide, Turkish communities stand on the other side of the street and they chant different slogans, or they play happy music that they... Sorry. Do you think there will be a time that one day that, not in Turkey, but let's start from the diaspora, Turkish communities can stand with the Armenians and commemorate the deaths of those killed during those years?
I hope so. I mean, hope by itself is not a strategy. There's no strategy for dealing with this. It's a very, very unfortunate situation. And what I've come to learn in dealing with the Armenian genocide issue here in Washington over the past 30 years, I used to work for Senator Al D'Amato in New York. And I remember working with him and helping to write his speeches when he would give magnificent speeches at the Armenian genocide commemoration that would take place in Times Square every year on April 24th. So I've been very privileged to be able to work with the Armenian American community on this very important issue. But I've learned a couple of things. One is, of course, the official Turkish government position, which is to simply deny that a genocide, as we've come to know it, took place. And the Turkish government operates under the rubric of a quote-unquote fog of war. Right? Everybody was involved in some horrific activities, and it was a very messy situation and the like, and absolving themselves of any responsibility. But the other thing that I've learned, Aram, is that the Turkish citizens themselves don't learn about the Armenian genocide in school in Turkey. I mean, that's obviously a government decision. So they don't know what we in the West have access to with history books and open research and historical archives and the like. So on the one hand, I'm not absolving Turks, because in this day and age where information is available to all people that have access to the internet, there's no excuse for not learning about this very important historical period. But keep in mind, the Turkish government has a dedicated policy going back 100 years of making sure that Turks don't learn about the Armenian genocide. And then when they do talk about it outside, most Turks get very defensive. they don't want to think of their country as a genocidal country. And even when you explain the legal difference between what was then the last days of the Ottoman Empire and the Young Turks, and for the most part, almost all of this took place before the establishment of the Turkish Republic as a modern republic as we know it. The Turkish government wants nothing to do with it, and therefore there's more of a nationalist, patriotic dedication to the Turkish government line. I have met a number of Turks who privately will concede to me, once they've read up on the Armenian genocide, it's undeniable. But there's a lot of social pressure in Turkish circles, and the government is absolutely committed for the foreseeable future to holding the line. So I think it's going to be difficult, but having said that, there really is no excuse for those people who don't want to accept the historical reality to insult and mock people. I mean, just as a human connection, to mock people for their suffering, even if I disagree with the political or legal terminology for what happened to somebody's grandparents or great-grandparents, to insult them and to mock them is subhuman. And I think those individuals have to look deep into their consciences and see to what extent they're acting like kind-hearted human beings, whatever the politics and legal differences exist in these communities.
Let's speak about the churches, the Armenian churches in Turkey. Still, there is a process in Turkey of converting these churches into mosques. For example, now one of the churches in Erzurum is being converted to a mosque. How can the world not see this, or international organizations? Do the organizations miss anything in this process?
No, I think they're doing their best under very difficult circumstances. And this is not a new process, neither in Turkey, going back to the Ottoman period, but even under the modern republic. From a Greek Orthodox perspective, I can tell you about Greek Orthodox churches that are not allowed to function. You have to get permits from the government in order to be able to practice your religious liberty, your religious freedom, which is not acceptable in a Western country, in a NATO country, or a country that aspires to join the European Union, such as Turkey. And now, as a matter of fact, the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, there are some, what I would call, more fanatical Islamists in Turkey who are calling for that. We would love to see it as an Orthodox cathedral, but it's a museum. It has been for quite some time, but there are some fanatics who now want it to be converted into a mosque, which would be an absolute disgrace. And you have this one as a Turkish government policy increasingly, and in ways, unfortunately, that Washington and Brussels are having less and less success in bringing to the attention of Turkish leaders in a way that would prevent this from continuing. And now with the EU accession talks moving in a negative direction, I think Brussels will have even less influence. But I think it's very important, Aram, for the Armenian government and Armenian organizations and the Apostolic Church to build coalitions, at least here in the United States, with other religious freedom organizations, to not keep this within the Armenian American community only, because there's not enough Armenian Americans to make this a national issue in the US, but to work with evangelicals, Protestants, Jews, even Muslims who are calling for religious freedom. In other words, to build as large a coalition as possible and get as many lawmakers as possible. And even if we have problems with the White House declaring Armenian genocide come April 24th, you can have the Congress and even the White House calling for the Turkish government to stop converting churches into mosques and to allow for as much religious freedom for all of its citizens as possible, as a simple understanding of the protection of minority rights, including religious freedom. So I think a larger religious freedom coalition that includes the Apostolic Church of Armenia can help attain that goal.
Do you think that any time US will recognize officially the Armenian genocide, particularly Mr. Trump, do you think he'll have a statement, as usually presidents do, a day before the commemoration of the genocide?
I believe President Trump will have a statement recognizing, however it's phrased, the horrific genocidal attacks. I mean, there's always a way to craft that language without using the phrase Armenian genocide. But unfortunately, I don't believe that President Trump or any US president in the foreseeable future would use that phrase, again, because the Turks are so important in so many national security objectives of the United States. And also, if you recall what happened back in 2000, I believe, when then Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, was going to allow the Armenian genocide resolution to come to the House floor. And President Clinton
yeah.
and the White House advised him that if there were any attacks against American citizens, diplomats or business executives or tourists in Turkey as a result of the genocide bill passing, that blood of Americans would be on the speaker's hands, and the speaker withdrew the resolution. So these are the kinds of intimidation tactics that we see to prevent lawmakers from moving forward. So I don't think that we're going to have a statement on Armenian genocide. And there's another reason also, Aram. I think the White House and the national security establishment here is also concerned, and probably the State Department also, that if there's a recognition of a quote-unquote historical dispute, which is the official terminology that we see here often, regarding the Armenian genocide, that we'll have other groups from around the world, even though besides the Holocaust of the Jewish population of Europe, there's been nothing like the Armenian genocide, but you'll have maybe a recognition of what happened with the Ukrainians under Stalin, what happened with the Cambodians under Pol Pot, and then we have all of these historical recognition issues. So I think that's also been a relatively effective argument, however unfortunate, but it's been effective in preventing the White House from setting a precedent with the genocide. But having
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but United States recognized Rwanda genocide and Darfur genocide. They did, right?
I don't know what the official terminology has been. It's a good question. I don't have the information offhand. But I'll tell you where I think there's a very positive development, and it's coming out in the next few days. And it's a matter of informing the American people through culture, storytelling. Most Americans don't know about the Armenian genocide. That's a fact. We don't learn it in our public schools. It's not part of everyday discussions here. But Hollywood and culture have a major impact. And so now with this movie, produced by the late Kirk Kerkorian, The Promise, if the movie is made as beautifully as we understand it to have been made and becomes a popular movie, not because of the politics, but because it's a beautiful story that people want to experience in movie theaters, and then at home after the theater experience, they will learn about the Armenian genocide and wonder, why hasn't the U.S. done more to recognize this? Then the Armenian American community has a spectacular opportunity to build on a story that many millions of Americans will know that they never knew before. You could see things change in 5 or 10 years, depending on how the story gets out. So Kirk Kerkorian, with this $100 million investment, may be doing more than anyone has done to transform the politics of the Armenian genocide by getting the story out to a large number of American citizens. We'll see.
Mr. Sitilides, thank you very much for this interview. Would you like to add anything?
One, first of all, I have great affection for the people of Armenia. I'm very concerned about the state of affairs facing Armenia today. It remains in a very unfortunate geographic position with two hostile neighbors, Turkey and Azerbaijan, and it's conducting trade through a relatively small country, Georgia, and another country, Iran, that is an implacable foe of the United States and the West, and is heavily dependent on Russia for its economy. What I'd love to see more than anything else is stronger ties between the U.S. and Armenia to help promote foreign direct investment in the country, to build stronger cultural ties, and to see what we could do as a country directly and with other countries to help rebuild Armenia as a magnificent country that it deserves to be, with a stronger economy, greater promise for the future, and a greater democracy for all of its citizens.
Mr. Sitilides, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.